He had 3 days to live. She had every reason to ride away, but she didn't. A cowboy, a fever, and a decision that would change 2 lives forever. Stay with us, because what happens next will remind you that the most important moments of your life rarely announce themselves. Welcome to our channel, where we tell the stories of the Old West, love, courage, the bond between mothers and children, and the raw compassion that makes us human. Because this story isn't just about survival, it's proof that one act of kindness can build an entire world. Like this story, hit subscribe and never miss the moment that changes everything.
The sun was just peeking over the flat horizon when Yates Xander finally gave out, slumping over his horse's neck. A fever was raging through his body, so fierce it made the air shimmer and warp right before his eyes. For 3 straight days he had pushed a small herd of cattle across the wide-open plains of western Nebraska, aiming for the stockyards in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Then the sickness ambushed him, quick and mean like a rattlesnake. It started as just a little scratch in his throat. A deep-down weariness, he figured, came from long days in the saddle under the brutal August sun of 1876. But by day 2, every muscle in his body screamed in protest. And by this 3rd morning, he knew he was in a world of hurt. The cattle had wandered off in the night while he was lost in a feverish sleep. Now he was all alone in that endless sea of grass, miles from any town. Friendly face. There was nothing but prairie in every direction, and a sky so big and blue it almost hurt to look at. Yates somehow managed to slide off his horse without falling flat on his face. His legs shook like a newborn calf's as he led the animal to a small creek he could hear gurgling nearby. The horse drank its fill while Yates just collapsed at the water's edge, plunging his entire head into the cool stream. For about 10 seconds it felt like paradise. But then the fever came roaring back, stronger than before. He dragged himself to a lone cottonwood tree, the only patch of decent shade for miles, and leaned his back against the rough bark. His canteen was almost bone dry, and all he had left for food was some hardtack and jerky, which his stomach wanted no part of. He figured he had a day left, maybe 2 if he got lucky, before the fever either broke or broke him for good. Out here, with nobody knowing where he was, the odds were not looking good. As the sun climbed higher, Yates faded in and out of his senses. His fever dreams got all tangled up with what was real until he could not tell the difference. He dreamed of growing up back in Tennessee, of the war that had taken his father and older brother from him. He dreamed of the long journey west that his mother had been so set on after the surrender. She had been gone 3 years now, taken by cholera, leaving Yates all by himself at 22. He had to make his own way in a world that seemed bent on crushing any man without a family or a fortune. He had been a ranch hand and a trail driver, taking any job that kept a roof over his head and food in his belly. This cattle drive was meant to be his big chance. It was his opportunity to finally earn enough to buy a little piece of land and build something of his own. Now, it looked like the prairie was going to swallow him up, just like it had so, and many others. Penelope Dalton had been riding since before the sun came up, pushing her mare at a steady lope across the open plains. She was on the hunt for strays from her father's herd, cattle that had gotten lost during a bad storm 2 nights back. Her daddy, Samuel Dalton, owned one of the biggest ranches right there on the Nebraska and Iowa line. And while he had more than enough ranch hands, Penelope had always been the finest tracker in the whole family. She learned it from her mother, who in turn had learned from a Pawnee woman that worked on the ranch long ago. Penelope could read stories in the bent grass and kicked up dirt that most fellas would ride right over without a second thought. She was 19 years old, with long chestnut hair she wore in a single braid down her back, and green eyes that could pick out a calf hiding in thick brush from 100 yards out. Her mother passed on when Penelope was just 15, and ever since, she had taken on more and more of the work around the place. Her father worried sometimes that she spent too much of her time working, and not nearly enough time letting the local boys try to win her affection. But Penelope had mighty little patience for the clumsy efforts of the ranch hands, who looked at her like she was some prize to be claimed, instead of a person to get to know. She felt more at home with her horses under an open sky, the wind on her face, and the feeling that she could ride wherever she pleased so long as it was inside the fences of her father's land. She had been on the trail of those strays for hours when she saw something strange way off in the distance. It was a horse, still wearing its saddle, just grazing quiet-like near a big cottonwood tree. There was no rider to be seen, which set off every alarm bell in her mind. A cowboy does not just walk off and leave his horse saddled up unless something has gone terribly wrong. She nudged her mare to go faster, her hand finding its way to the rifle she always carried. She kept on her saddle. When she got closer, she saw him, a figure slumped against the base of the tree, barely moving at all. Penelope jumped down from her horse, quickly securing the reins before she walked toward the man. He was young, probably just a few years older than she was, with dark hair stuck to his forehead with sweat. His skin looked pale under his tan, and even from a few feet away, she could see him trembling. She knelt down beside him and placed the back of her hand on his forehead. He was burning up, so hot with fever she was amazed he was still alive. "Hey there," she said, giving his shoulder a gentle shake. "Can you hear me?" Yates's eyes fluttered open, but they were glassy and unfocused. He mumbled something she could not make out, his voice thick and confused. Penelope took a quick look around, sizing up the situation. They were a good 10 miles from her father's ranch, and maybe 15 from the closest town. Trying to move him in his condition was risky, but leaving him here was a certain death sentence. She bit her lip, her mind racing. The sun was getting higher, and the temperature was already climbing toward 90 degrees. If she was going to help this man, she had to get his fever down first. She had to get some water into him, and then figure out how to get him to safety. She went over to his horse, a solid sorrel gelding. The horse watched her with weary eyes, but did not cause any trouble. She rummaged through the saddlebags and found a nearly empty canteen and a bedroll, and not much else. She took the bedroll and her own supplies back to the cottonwood tree, where she quickly spread a blanket out in the shade. Then she took both canteens to the creek and filled them with cool, fresh water. When she returned, she gently lifted Yates's head and tried to get him to take a drink. He choked and sputtered at first, but his body's desperate thirst soon took over. He managed to swallow several gulps before slumping back against the tree. Penelope soaked her bandana in the creek water and pressed the cool cloth to his forehead, his neck, and his wrists. She had watched her mother nurse many a sick ranch hand through a bad fever, and she remembered the important parts. You had to keep them cool, you had to keep them hydrated, and you had to pray that the sickness would pass before it took them. She worked without stopping, re-soaking the cloth every few minutes as the sun warmed it up. She patiently coaxed small sips of water past his dry, cracked lips, whispering soft words of comfort that she doubted he could even hear. The hours dragged on. The sun climbed to its highest point in the sky, and then began its slow journey toward the west. Penelope did not leave his side. She knew she probably should ride back to the ranch and get help, bring back a wagon and some of her father's men. But something held her there. Maybe it was the memory of her mother, who always said that leaving a sick person to fend for themselves was a terrible thing to do. Maybe it was something in the man's face. Even with the fever twisting his features, he looked kind and decent, like someone who had seen his share of trouble but had not let it turn him mean. Or maybe it was just her own stubborn streak, the same part of her that refused to give up on a difficult horse or a weak newborn calf. For whatever reason, Penelope stayed put. As evening came on, Yates's fever seemed to get even worse. He began to thrash around weakly, muttering words she could not understand, his body fighting a war she could not see. Penelope managed to pull him onto the bedroll, using her own saddle blanket to cushion his head. As the temperature started to drop, she built a small fire. She knew that even though he was hot with fever, the cold night air could give him a chill once the sun was gone. She made a thin broth from some dried beef she had in her saddlebags and got a few spoonfuls into him before he turned his head away. Night settled over the prairie, and with it came the sound of crickets and the far-off howl of coyotes. Penelope sat with her back against the cottonwood tree, the sick cowboy's head resting on a folded blanket near her. She kept the fire going and stood her watch, changing the cool cloth on his head and offering him water whenever he stirred. She dozed off and on, jolting awake at every little sound, always checking to make sure he was still breathing, still putting up a fight. It was nearly dawn when the fever finally started to break. Penelope noticed it first in the way his breathing became easier and less strained. His restless movements calmed down into what looked more like real sleep. She put her hand on his forehead and felt that while he was still warm, that awful burning heat was gone. Relief washed over her so powerfully that she felt her eyes well up with tears. She had not let herself admit how scared she had been, how sure she was that she was watching a man die, until the danger had started to pass. Yates woke up slowly, his mind coming back to him in bits and pieces. His first thought was that he must have died, because there was surely an angel looking down at him. But as his vision cleared, he saw that the woman leaning over him was very real, with a smudge of dirt on her cheek and pure exhaustion etched into her face. The first thing he noticed were her eyes, greener than any field he had ever laid eyes on. They held a look of both worry and thankfulness. "You are finally awake," she said, her voice soft and soothing like a cool drink on a scorching day. "Tell me how you are feeling." Yates opened his mouth to answer, but only a dry rasp came out. She understood without him saying a word, carefully raising his head and holding a water flask to his mouth. He drank deep, and that simple water felt like the finest thing he had ever known. After he had enough, he was able to whisper one word: "Better." A small smile touched her lips, and despite the weakness in his bones, Yates felt a strange warmth spread through him. "That is good to hear. You surely gave me a fright. I stumbled upon you yesterday morning, hot as a furnace with a terrible fever. You have been delirious for nearly a whole day and night." The words sank in slowly. A whole day. This unknown woman had watched over him for that long, all by herself, out here in the wide open country, helping him fight a sickness that could have easily taken him. "Why?" He finally got the word out. The gentle smile on Penelope's face hardened with conviction. "I could not just leave a man to face his end all alone. That is not a thing I can do." She added, "My name is Penelope Dalton. My daddy's ranch is about 10 miles east of this spot." "Yates," he answered, feeling his voice return with a bit more strength. "Yates Zander. I was pushing a herd up toward Council Bluffs when the sickness hit me." He stopped, and a terrible thought struck him. "The cattle. They must have scattered. I have lost the whole herd." "A man can always find more cattle," Penelope said with a steady voice. "But you only get one life. You just rest. As soon as you have the strength to sit a horse, I will guide you to my father's place. You need some real meals and a proper bed, not this hard ground." Yates felt the need to protest, to explain that he had to find that herd. His entire future was riding on that cattle drive. But his own body would not listen, and a deep weariness dragged him back into darkness. Just before his eyelids shut, he saw Penelope's face, lit by the rising sun. She was watching him with a kind of fierce protection that caused a pang in his chest, a feeling completely separate from his sickness. He slept for the better part of the morning. Each time he drifted awake, he found Penelope nearby, always with a sip of water or a little something to eat. She had managed to trap a rabbit and cook a real stew. She gave it to him in small spoonfuls, careful not to overwhelm his empty stomach. By late afternoon, he was strong enough to sit up on his own, even if the world spun a little. "You take good care of a person," he told her, taking another cup of her warm broth. "Did your mother teach you that?" A flicker of old sadness passed over Penelope's features. "Yes, she did. She has been gone 4 years now. A winter pneumonia took her. It came on quick and left us just as fast." "I'm real sorry to hear that," Yates said, and he truly was. "I lost my own mother 3 years ago. It is a tough thing feeling all alone in this world. Penelope looked him square in the eye, and for a long moment they shared a silent understanding. Both of them had faced that kind of hurt. They had both been forced to be tough because falling apart was not an option. They were two people trying to make their way in a world that can be unforgiving when you have no family to lean on. "You are not married, then?" Yates asked, and right away felt foolish for saying it. A married woman would not be out on the range by herself, tending to a sick stranger. But Penelope did not take any offense. "No. The men in these parts generally look for a woman who is happy to keep a house, cook the meals, and raise children. I was never much for staying indoors." She said this simply, without any hint of shame or excuse. "And what about you?" she asked. "I never had the coin or a steady place to offer a good woman," Yates confessed. "I have been moving from one job to the next ever since the war was over. This cattle drive was meant to be my fresh start. The pay was good enough to maybe get a piece of land to finally build something of my own." His voice faded as he glanced out at the vast, empty land. "Well, now you are alive," Penelope stated with force. "And that means you can figure out a different path. One failed plan is not the end of the world." She got to her feet, dusting off her practical riding skirt. "Do you think you can stand? We ought to see if you can get on your horse. We need to see if you can make the ride to the ranch. My father is surely getting worried, and you could use a real meal." Yates took her offered hand and she helped him up. For a second the whole prairie seemed to tip sideways, but her firm hold kept him from falling, and he stayed on his feet until his balance came back. He realized then that she was strong, not just in her will, but physically too. He could feel the solid muscle in her arm and the steady way she stood. This was clearly a woman who knew hard work and was not afraid of a challenge. They walked over to the horses, and Penelope gave him a hand as he struggled up into his saddle. His reddish-brown horse shifted a bit, but stood its ground. Penelope swung onto her own horse with a smooth, practiced motion. She rode up close beside him, ready to catch his reins if he looked like he might tumble. "We will go nice and easy," she told him. "You let me know if you need to stop. A man's pride is a poor reason to die." The journey to the Dalton Ranch lasted a few long hours. Yates felt his energy draining away, and he had to ask to stop and rest 2 different times. Yet Penelope never once seemed annoyed or hurried. She just waited patiently, gave him some water, and then they would start again. Carried on. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky when they came over the top of a small hill. Down below, Yates saw the entire ranch laid out before him. It was a bigger and more successful place than he had imagined. The main house was a solid 2-story building made from wood and rock with a big porch that went all the way around. He saw several barns, enclosures filled with livestock, a bunkhouse for the cowboys, and a few other buildings he could not identify. A thread of smoke was rising from the chimney of the main house. He could make out small figures of people going about their evening chores. As they rode into the main yard, a man came out of the house. He walked with the kind of determined gait that showed he was feeling both relieved and mad at the same time. The man was tall, with wide shoulders and hair that was more silver than not. His face was tanned and lined, from a lifetime of wind and weather. That must be Samuel Dalton, Yates figured, and he prepared himself for the anger of a father whose daughter had been missing for a full day. "Penelope Grace Dalton," Samuel's voice boomed across the yard. "Where on God's green earth have you been? I was just about to round up the hands to go look for you." Penelope slid off her horse and strode right up to her father. She held her head high with a stubborn set to her jaw that Yates was starting to know well. "I came across a man on the prairie who was near death from a fever. I could not just ride on, so I stayed with him until it broke. He is still weak, but he is getting better. We need to bring him inside, give him a hot meal, and put him in a proper bed to rest." Just like that, Samuel's frustration seemed to melt away. In its place was worry, and maybe even a little bit of pride. He glanced over his daughter's shoulder at Yates, who was trying his hardest to sit tall on his horse, even though he felt like he could keel over any second. "Can you make it on your own 2 feet, son?" "Yes, sir," Yates replied, getting down from the horse more carefully than elegantly. His legs shook under him, but he forced himself to stand straight. Samuel stepped over and put Yates's arm around his own broad shoulders to steady him. Only a stubborn fool would drive cattle by himself in this kind of heat. You are fortunate my daughter came along when she did. Let us get you into the house. Penelope, you go tell Maria we are going to need some broth and bread. Get the guest room ready for him. The next several hours were a haze for Yates. He found himself settled in a pleasant room upstairs. Someone helped him into a fresh nightshirt that was probably Samuel Dalton's. Then a serious-looking woman named Maria fed him hot broth. She seemed to run the household and be part of the family all at once. She fussed over him, whispering in Spanish about young men who had less sense than a billy goat, but her touch was kind as she felt his head for any sign of fever and made certain he finished all of his soup. Penelope looked in on him a few times, her piercing green eyes checking his progress, and every time she did, Yates felt a peculiar jump in his heart. It was a feeling that had zero to do with being sick and everything to do with the woman who had rescued him. He attempted to express his gratitude, but she just dismissed it with a gesture. "Just rest," was all she said. "We will have plenty of time to talk once you have your strength back." That night, Yates fell into a profound sleep, the most peaceful rest he had known in a long time. He awoke the next day with bright sunshine pouring in his window and the wonderful aroma of coffee and bacon coming from the kitchen. The fever was completely gone. He still felt drained, but his mind was sharp. He was able to get into his own clothes, which had been washed and neatly placed on a chair for him. He carefully made his way downstairs on legs that still felt a bit wobbly. The dining room was a cozy, welcoming place. It had a big table with enough chairs for at least 12 people. Samuel Dalton was at the far end, looking at a newspaper while he drank his coffee. Penelope was beside him, already in her work clothes for the day, with her hair tied back in its usual braid. Maria came hurrying out of the kitchen with a large plate of bacon and eggs. A younger woman who looked just like her followed close behind. It had to be her daughter. "Good to see you're up," Samuel said, pointing to a vacant chair. "You better sit yourself down before you tip over. Maria, this young fella needs some breakfast. He looks like a good gust of wind could knock him flat. Him a chair." Yates sank into it, grateful, taking the plate of food handed to him. He took his time eating, his stomach still feeling a bit delicate, but every bite tasted like heaven after days of fever and misery. While he ate, Samuel asked him about his past, his line of work, and his plans for the future. Yates told him the straight truth, explaining about the cattle drive, the sickness, and the herd he had lost. "Did those cattle belong to anyone in particular?" Samuel asked. "A rancher by the name of Tom Hutchkins. He runs a spread about 60 miles west of here. He hired me to push them to the stockyards in Council Bluffs. I was meant to meet his regular crew up there, but I reckon I will not be making that rendezvous now." Samuel thought on this for a moment. "Hutchkins is a decent man. I know of him. He will not blame you for the loss, not when he hears you nearly died in the attempt. But you will have to get word to him. Let him know what came to pass. In the meantime, you need to stay put right here and get your strength back. There is no sense in you heading back out on that range half dead. You can work for me for a couple of weeks, get your feet back under you, and earn some money to make up for what you lost." Gratitude washed over Yates in a powerful wave. "Sir, I am at a loss for words." "That is mighty generous of you." "It is just practical," Samuel said, correcting him. "I can always use another good hand, especially one my daughter claims has enough sense not to abuse his horse." He cut a look over at Penelope, who was doing her level best to look like butter would not melt in her mouth. "Besides, you owe your life to Penelope. The very least you can do is stick around long enough for us to be sure you are fully mended." And just like that, Yates Zander found himself, quite unexpectedly, a temporary part of the Dalton Ranch family. The first few days, he was not allowed to do much more than light chores. He mended tack, helped Maria in her kitchen garden, and handled other small jobs that kept him near the main house. But as his strength came back, Samuel assigned him more demanding work. Yates showed he was a capable man, good with horses and cattle, always willing to work hard and learn fast. He also noticed he was spending more and more of his time with Penelope. She seemed to find him throughout the day, popping up at his elbow when he was in the corral or riding out to check on the cattle. They fell into an easy rhythm of conversation, talking about everything and nothing at all. She told him about her life growing up on the ranch, about losing her mother, and how that changed everything for their family. He told her about Tennessee, about the war that tore his childhood home apart, and about his dream of one day owning his own piece of land. Why land? Penelope asked him one afternoon as they rode along the ranch's northern fence line. Why not just keep on as a hired hand? It is less responsibility, less of a gamble. Yates was quiet for a spell, trying to find the right words. Because I want to build something that is all mine, something no one can just take away or burn down or tell me I am not good enough for. Maybe that sounds foolish, but I want to know my hard work is going towards something that will last, something that might even be there after I am gone. Penelope nodded slowly. That is not foolish at all. I understand wanting to build something. That is what my father did, and what my mother helped him do. This whole ranch is what they left behind. Sometimes I wonder what I will leave behind. You could have this ranch, Yates pointed out. Your father will not be around forever, and you know this place better than anybody. Maybe, Penelope said. But she did not sound too sure of herself. But there are plenty of folks who believe a woman cannot run a ranch by herself. My father has cousins back east who have dropped hints more than once that when he is gone, the ranch ought to go to a man who can manage it the right way. They do not care that I have been helping to run it since I was 15. The unfairness of it all made Yates's blood simmer. He had seen Penelope at work. She was as capable as any man on that ranch, and better than most. The whole idea that she would be overlooked just because she was a woman seemed crazy and cruel. Well then, you will just have to prove them all wrong, he said firmly. Show them you can run this place better than any man they could ever name. Penelope gave him a smile, and Yates felt that funny little flutter in his chest again. I like the way your mind works, Yates Zander. As the weeks turned, Yates had to admit that what he felt for Penelope Dalton was a whole lot more than just gratitude or friendship. He was falling for her, hard and fast, with no turning back. It was in the way his spirits lifted clean up to the sky every time he laid eyes on her. The way he was always finding reasons to be working somewhere nearby her. The way her laugh could make the toughest day feel like it was all worth it. He loved her grit and her stubborn streak, her gentle heart and her steady hands. He loved the way she sat a horse like she was born to it. The way she could calm a wild colt with just a bit of patience and some soft words. The way she looked out at the prairie like it was the most beautiful painting she had ever seen. But Yates also knew he had absolutely nothing to offer a woman like her. He was just a drifter with no land to his name, no money in his pocket, and no future beyond the wages that Samuel paid him. Penelope Dalton deserved a man who was already established, someone who could give her the safe and comfortable life she was owed. So he kept all those feelings locked up tight inside, buried down deep where they could not cause trouble for either one of them. What Yates had no way of knowing was that Penelope was fighting the very same battle inside her own heart. She never planned on falling in love with the cowboy she had found near death out on the range, but love had a way of creeping up on her like a prairie sunrise, slow at first, and then suddenly it was everywhere. She loved his quiet way of being strong, the way he worked harder than anyone without a single word of complaint, the gentleness he had in his hands whenever he was with the animals. She loved his dreams of building something that would last, and his refusal to let a hard life turn him sour. She loved the way he looked at her, like she was someone to be truly admired, not just her father's daughter, or a woman to be courted for the land she would one day inherit. But Penelope also understood the hard truth of their situation. Her father liked Yates just fine as a ranch hand, but that was a far cry from him approving of Yates as a suitor for his only daughter. Samuel Dalton wanted his daughter to marry well to a man with land and money, someone who could provide for her and help keep the ranch secure for the future. A drifting cowboy, no matter how good his heart, just was not part of that plan. The silence between them, filled with everything they wanted to say, was stretched tight as a new fence wire. just waiting to break. It finally snapped one evening in late September. The weather was starting to change, the blistering heat of August making way for cooler nights and the first signs of autumn. Yates had been on the ranch for nearly 6 weeks, and Samuel had mentioned that he would be welcome to stay on for good if he wanted. It was a fine offer, more than Yates had any right to hope for, but the thought of staying on as a hired hand, watching Penelope eventually marry some other man, was more than he could stand. He was in the barn, getting the horses settled for the night, when Penelope found him. She stood there in the doorway with the setting sun behind her, and for a second, Yates Plum forgot how to breathe. She walked toward him, slow and steady, her face impossible to read. "You are fixin' to leave," she said. It was not a question. Yates put down the brush he was using on his horse and turned to face her straight on. "I have been thinking on it. Your father has been more than fair, but I cannot just work here forever. I need to get on my own path, start building what I want." "What is it you want?" Penelope asked, stepping a little closer. Yates felt the walls he had built around his heart start to shake. "I want my own land, a place to build a home, raise some cattle, maybe have a family one day. I want something permanent, something real with anyone in particular." Penelope's voice was soft, but her eyes were burning bright. Yates knew he ought to lie to protect them both from the truth of what he was feeling. But standing there in the fading light with Penelope looking at him like he held the answer to a question she was scared to even ask, he just could not do it. "With you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "If I am being honest, everything I want starts and ends with you. But I've not got a thing to offer you, Penelope. I am just a cowboy with no land, no money, and no future beyond whatever job comes next. You deserve so much more than that." Penelope closed the last bit of space between them, reaching up to touch his cheek with a tenderness that made his heart ache. "Bless your heart, Yates Zander. You really are a fool. Do you honestly think I care about money or land? I have land. I know how to run a ranch. What I do not have is a partner. Someone who sees what I can do and respects it. Someone who does not want to change me into something I am not. What I do not have is someone who makes me feel like my heart is about to beat right out of my chest just by being in the same room with him. What I do not have is you." Yates just stared at her, not daring to believe the words he was hearing. "Penelope, I cannot ask you to give up your inheritance, your home, for a man with nothing but a pocket full of dreams. You are not asking. I am offering." Penelope's voice was strong and sure. "I love you, Yates. I think I have loved you since you looked at me with those fever-bright eyes and just trusted me to save you. I have loved you every day since, watching you work and dream, and just be kind to every person and animal you meet. I do not care if you have land or money. We can build all that together. What I cannot do is build a life with a man I do not love. I do not care how much land he owns." Yates felt something finally break free inside his chest. A flood of emotion he had been holding back for weeks on end. Yates pulled Penelope into his arms, holding her like she was the most valuable thing on this earth, because to him, she was. He whispered into her hair, "I love you. Lord help me. I love you more than I ever thought a man could love a woman." Penelope leaned her head back and Yates kissed her. It was not some shy, testing kiss. It was a statement, a vow, a claim. She met his passion with her own, her fingers tangling in his hair as she pressed her body close to his. When they finally parted for air, both of them breathless, Penelope was smiling in a way that made Yates want to start all over again. "So, what happens now?" he asked. "I can't imagine your father's going to be tickled pink about his daughter taking up with a hired hand." Penelope's smile got a little bit of mischief in it. "Then we'll just have to show him you are much more than that. We will convince him you are a man with a vision, with grit, and with the heart to help build something that lasts. You just leave my father to me." Getting Samuel Dalton on their side turned out to be less of a fight than they had braced for, though it had its share of tight moments. The very next night at the dinner table, when Penelope declared that she and Yates were in love and planned to marry, Samuel's face went through a whole rainbow of colors. He took a long, hard look at his daughter, then at Yates, then back at his daughter again. "You are serious about this," he finally stated. "Completely," Penelope answered, her voice steady and sure. "Yates is a good man, Daddy. You know he is. You have seen his work ethic. You have seen his character. I love him, and he loves me. I am asking for your blessing, but I will marry him whether I have it or not." Samuel shifted his gaze to Yates, who was trying his best not to look like a man fixing to run for the hills. "And you? What have you got to say for yourself, son?"
Yates drew a deep breath and looked Samuel straight in the eye. "Sir, I know I do not have much to give your daughter when it comes to money or land. But I can give you my word that I will work harder than any man you have ever met to make sure she is happy and safe. I love her, Mr. Dalton. I will spend every single day of my life trying to be the man she deserves."
Samuel was silent for what felt like an eternity. Then a slow smile started to spread across his weathered face. "You know, my wife's father said pretty much the same thing to me when I asked for her hand. He was a rich man, owned a big old spread down in Texas. I was a nobody, just a cowpoke with big ideas and empty pockets. But Sarah, she loved me, and she talked her daddy into giving us a chance. It was the best decision any of us ever made." He stood up, walked around the table, and stuck out his hand to Yates. "You have my blessing, son, but if you ever cause her a single tear, I will hunt you down to the ends of the earth." Yates firmly shook Samuel's hand, a wave of relief washing over him. "I understand, sir. Thank you. There is one condition, though," Samuel added, his face turning serious again. "This ranch is going to be Penelope's one day. That means it will be yours, too, if you marry her. But you need to understand what that means. This is not about you stepping in and taking charge. This is about you being a partner to my daughter. It means you support her choices and respect her know-how. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Yates said without a moment's pause. "Penelope knows this land better than I ever could. I would be a fool not to listen to her. Besides, that is what I want. A partnership, not a one-man show." Samuel nodded, looking satisfied. "Good. Then I suppose we have a wedding to plan. Maria is going to be beside herself with excitement. That woman has been trying to marry Penelope off for years." They got married in early November of 1876, in a simple service right there at the ranch. The local preacher said the words, and nearly all the ranch hands and neighboring families came to watch. Penelope wore her mother's wedding dress, which had been kept safe in a trunk for years, and just needed a few changes to fit her taller build. Yates was in a new suit that Samuel had insisted on buying for him, saying that his future son-in-law was not getting hitched in dusty jeans and a work shirt. As Yates watched Penelope walk toward him, with the autumn sun making her hair shine like polished copper, he thought about how close he had come to dying out on that prairie. If Penelope had not found him, if she had not stayed by his side and nursed him back to life, he would never have known this kind of joy. It felt like a dream that just a few months ago they were complete strangers, and now they were about to promise their whole lives to one another. But sometimes the greatest gifts in life show up when you are not even looking for them, born from trouble and luck, and the simple choice to help another soul when they need it most. The ceremony was short but full of heart. When the preacher announced they were husband and wife, Yates kissed Penelope with all the love, gratitude, and hope that filled him. The crowd cheered, and Maria dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her apron, whispering in Spanish about the beauty of young love. The party that followed was a loud and happy affair. Tables were set up under the open sky, piled high with food that Maria and some of the other ranch wives had cooked up. There was roasted beef and warm bread, pies made from the last of the season's apples, and plenty of cider and beer for anyone who was thirsty. Somebody brought out a fiddle, and pretty soon, music was floating on the breeze, calling folks out to dance. Yates danced with his new wife, then with Maria, and then with a few of the neighbor women who wanted to give him a proper welcome to the community. Penelope danced with her father, and tears of joy streamed down both their faces, making Yates's own throat feel a little tight. As the sun went down and lanterns were lit, Yates gently pulled Penelope away from the party. He led her to the barn where they had first admitted their feelings for each other. They stood there in the quiet dark, listening to the faint sounds of the celebration, wrapped up in each other's arms. "Are you happy?" Yates asked, kissing the top of her head. "More than I can say," Penelope whispered, looking up at him with those green eyes that had captured him from the very first time he saw them. "But I have something to tell you." "What is that?" "When I found you out there on the prairie, burning up with fever, I had this strange feeling, like destiny had put you right in my path for a reason. I told myself I was being silly, that I was just taking care of a sick man and that would be all. But a little piece of me knew, even back then, that you were going to change my whole life." Yates smiled and touched her cheek. "You changed mine. You saved it in more ways than just one. I was just drifting before I found you, Penelope, moving from one town to the next with no real purpose other than to get by. You gave me a reason to build something that would last, something real. You gave me a home." They kissed again, a slow, gentle kiss that was a promise of all the years they would share. When they finally walked back to the party holding hands, the first stars were starting to pop out in the sky. A million little lights were scattered across the huge, dark prairie. The first year of their marriage was a time of learning and settling in. Yates had to wrap his head around the idea that this ranch was his home now, that he was more than a hired hand. He was a partner in the whole outfit. Samuel was a good teacher, showing him the business end of ranching, from contracts and bargaining to dealing with the cattle buyers who kept the ranch going. Penelope taught him about the land itself, showing him the best spots for grazing, where to find water even in the driest years, and how to tell which cows were the best for breeding. They also learned about each other, all the small, quiet things that come with being married. Yates found out that Penelope was a little grumpy in the mornings before she had her coffee, that she talked to the horses like they were old friends, and that she cried at weddings but never at funerals. Penelope learned that Yates sometimes had nightmares about the war, that he was ticklish just behind his left ear, and that he could not carry a tune in a bucket, but hummed while he worked anyway. They had their disagreements, of course. Yates's pride got in the way sometimes, making it hard for him to admit that Penelope usually knew best when it came to the ranch. Penelope sometimes had a hard time remembering to include him in choices she had been making on her own for years. But they learned to talk things out, to remember they were a team, and that respecting each other was more important than winning an argument. By the spring of 1878, they had found their own comfortable rhythm. The ranch was doing better than ever under their joint leadership. Yates had shown he was not just a good cowboy, but also a smart negotiator who could get good prices for their cattle and open up new markets. Penelope kept running the day-to-day work on the ranch with the same skills she always had. Together, they were building something bigger and better than either of them could have done alone. It was in June of that year that Penelope told Yates she was expecting their first child. He was in the barn, putting a new shoe on one of the horses, when she showed up in the doorway with a funny look on her face. He dropped his tools right away, worried something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, walking over to her. "Nothing is wrong," Penelope said. Then she broke into a smile that was both brilliant and a little bit scared. "I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." Yates felt like the wind had been knocked out of him, but in the best way imaginable. A child. Their very own child. He gathered Penelope into his arms, handling her so gently you would think she was made of glass. "Are you certain? Maria claims all the signs are pointing to it, and that woman has helped bring half the babies in this county into the world. She is rarely ever wrong about these things." Penelope leaned back to study his face. "Does this make you happy? I know we have not spent much time talking about children, but I truly want this baby, Yates. I want us to raise a family together right here." "Happy is not a big enough word for what I am feeling,"
Yates said, his voice thick with a storm of emotions. "I am scared to death and excited as all get out and just so thankful all at once. We are going to have a baby." Samuel was overjoyed by the news, and he put his foot down immediately that Penelope was not to do any more heavy lifting around the ranch. Penelope just rolled her eyes at how protective he had become overnight, but she did promise to take things easier, especially as the months went by and her body began to change. Yates fussed over her and was so overprotective in a way that Penelope found both aggravating and sweet, but she put up with it, knowing it was all because he loved her. Their son came into the world in February of 1879, right in the middle of a cold snap that froze the water trough solid and had everyone huddled up close to their fires. The birth was a long, hard road, with Maria and the local midwife right there beside her. Yates wore a path in the floorboards, pacing in the hall just outside the bedroom door, listening to Penelope's cries and feeling about as useless as a screen door on a submarine. Samuel sat with him, offering quiet words of comfort that did almost nothing to calm his nerves. When Maria finally came out, grinning from ear to ear, and told him he had a son and that Penelope was worn out but doing just fine, Yates felt like he might just collapse from pure relief. He hurried into the bedroom and found Penelope propped up on a mountain of pillows, exhausted and sweating and looking more beautiful than any woman he had ever laid eyes on, holding a little bundle wrapped up tight in blankets. She looked up at him, her own eyes filled with tears. "Come and meet your son," she whispered. Yates moved toward the bed slowly, like he was walking on holy ground, and peered down at the tiny face peeking out of the blankets. His son had a full head of dark hair, and eyes that were still that newborn blue, though they might turn brown or green as he got older. He had the smallest, most perfect fingers that curled up on their own when Yates gently touched his hand. Looking at his child, at this brand new life he and Penelope had made together, Yates was overcome with feelings so powerful there were no words for them. It was love for sure, but also a fierce need to protect him, a powerful resolve to be the kind of father this little boy deserved, and to give him the steady, loving home that Yates himself had lost when he was just a boy. "He is just perfect," Yates whispered. "What are we going to name him?" They had talked about names while she was expecting, but none of them had ever felt quite right. Now, gazing down at her son, Penelope said, "Samuel, after my father. He has been so very good to us, Yates. I want to honor him." Yates just nodded, a lump the size of a fist in his throat. He leaned over to kiss Penelope's forehead, and then his son's. Samuel Zander, now that is a good, strong name. Little Samuel was a healthy and happy baby who seemed to have gotten his mother's stubborn streak and his father's easygoing nature. As he got bigger, it was plain to see he also got his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, a perfect mix of the both of them. Samuel Dalton absolutely doted on his grandson, spending hour after hour rocking him or just carrying him around the ranch, pointing out the horses and the cattle and telling him stories about his mama when she was a little girl. Life fell into a new rhythm, a rhythm that followed the seasons of ranch work and the needs of a growing little boy. Yates and Penelope were a team, running the ranch and raising their son side by side. They hired on some extra hands so Penelope could have her mornings with Samuel before she had to go oversee the day's chores. Yates learned how to balance the account books with a sleeping baby nestled in the crook of his arm. Maria became like a grandmother to the boy, teaching little Samuel songs in Spanish and sneaking him sweet treats when his parents had their backs turned. As Samuel grew from a baby to a toddler and then a young boy, the ranch just kept on thriving. Word got around that Yates was an honest man to do business with and a top-notch rancher, and before long the Dalton Zander Ranch was one of the most respected outfits in the whole territory. When Samuel Dalton passed on in his sleep in 1885, at the ripe old age of 67, it was a sad day, but not a surprising one. He had lived long enough to see his grandson grow into a smart, lively 6-year-old who loved horses and the wide-open prairie just as much as his mother and grandfather had. He had gotten to see his daughter happy and doing well, with the ranch safe in the hands of two people who loved the land and loved each other.
It was, just as Yates said at the service, a good life that was lived to the fullest. Penelope missed her father something fierce, but she found comfort in knowing how proud he had been of her and of everything she and Yates had built together. The ranch was officially theirs now, though truth be told they had been the ones running it for years. They did not change a single thing about how it was run, keeping up the high standards Samuel had always set, and just kept building on the solid foundation he had left for them. More children came along. A daughter they named Rose was born in 1881, and then another son, Daniel, came in 1884. Each new baby was a cause for celebration, each child another blessing, another. The house was filled with the sound of laughter and the happy noise of growing children. Samuel, being the oldest, took his job as big brother quite seriously, always looking out for his little brother and sister with a protective streak that put Yates in mind of Penelope. Rose was a wild and fearless little thing, climbing trees and riding horses before she could even walk properly, giving her folks plenty of gray hairs with all her adventures. Daniel was the quiet one, more thoughtful, and he had a special way with animals that even Penelope had to admire. Yates found his mind drifting back to that day out on the open range when he had collapsed in a heap, burning with fever, absolutely certain he was going to die all alone out in that vast emptiness. He thought about Penelope riding out to find him, staying right by his side through the worst of it, flat out refusing to leave him to whatever fate had in store. That one choice, that simple act of human kindness, had changed the course of both their lives forever. It had given him everything he had ever dared to dream of, and a whole lot more on top of that. A real home, a family, a partnership that was built on love and respect and shared dreams. He had a legacy that would carry on long after they were both gone. As the years went by, the love between Yates and Penelope only grew deeper. They had made it through droughts and hard winters, sickness in the cattle herds and times when money was tight, all the usual struggles that life throws at you. But they had faced every single one of them together, and each storm they weathered just brought them closer. They still worked alongside each other on the ranch, even though they now had good foremen and ranch hands to take care of most of the day-to-day work. They taught their children the value of a hard day's work, the importance of treating every person and every animal with kindness, and the need to stand up for what is right, especially when it is the hardest thing to do. On their 10th wedding anniversary, in November of 1886, Yates took Penelope back out to the cottonwood tree where she had found him. It was a cold day with winter, already settling its grip on the prairie, but that old tree was still standing, like a lone guard on the open range. They stood together in the very spot where Penelope had watched over him all those years ago, where she had fought for his life, and without knowing it, for the future they would have together. "I still remember how scared I was," Penelope said, leaning her head against Yates's shoulder as they looked out over the endless grass. "You were so sick, and I knew if that fever did not break, you were going to die. I just kept thinking that I could not let that happen, that you were meant for something better than dying alone on the prairie. I had no idea back then that what you were meant for was me, was us, and this whole life we were going to build." Yates turned her to look at him, holding her face gently in his hands. "You saved my life that day, Penelope. But you did more than that. You gave my life a purpose. Everything I am, everything I have, every good thing I hoped to be, it all started right here when you chose to stay when anyone else would have just ridden on by. I love you more than words can say. I will love you until my last breath, and even after that, if the good Lord allows it." They kissed right there under the cottonwood tree, the same tree that had given them shelter in their darkest time, now standing witness to their happiness. The wind howled around them, sharp and cold, but they were warm in each other's arms, sheltered by a love they had built piece by piece, day by day, one choice at a time. The years kept on rolling past, marked by the turning of the seasons and the big moments in their children's lives. Samuel grew into a fine young man, taking on more and more responsibility around the ranch, and it was clear as day he was meant to run the place himself one day. He fell head over heels for the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a smart and capable young woman named Catherine, who reminded Yates a whole lot of Penelope. They were married in 1896 when Samuel was 17 and Catherine was 18, in a wedding that was even bigger and more joyful than Yates and Penelope's had been. Rose, staying true to her wild spirit, took a bit longer to settle down. She worked on the ranch right alongside her brothers, refusing to be pushed into the things ladies were supposed to do. She finally fell for a horse trader who came through the area regular-like, a man who loved her fierce independence and could match her spirit for spirit. Daniel, the youngest, had a real gift for working with difficult horses, and he started up a training operation on the far corner of the ranch, making a name for himself all over the territory for his patience and his skill. By 1900, Yates and Penelope were grandparents several times over, with Samuel and Catherine came along and blessed them with 3 grandbabies, one right after the other. That old ranch house had to stretch its walls over the years to make room for the growing clan, and it was always filled with the racket of little ones playing and learning. It was another generation put on this earth to love the land and to love each other. Yates and Penelope, well, they got older, just like folks do. Yates's hair, once dark as a starless night, had turned mostly silver, and Penelope's face wore the map of her years in the sun and wind. But they were still spry, still had their hands in the ranch's business, and were still just as much in love as ever. Most evenings you would find them on the porch, just sitting and watching the sun dip below that big prairie sky they cherished. Sometimes they would talk about the old days, back when they were courting and just starting out. Other times they would talk about what was to come, about their kids and grandkids and the life they were building, and sometimes they would just sit there in a comfortable quiet, holding hands, with no need for words to say all the things they felt. On a warm summer evening in 1905, as they watched the lightning bugs start their nightly dance, Penelope spoke softly. "You ever get to thinking what might have happened if I hadn't come across you that day? If I'd taken a different trail, or figured those strays weren't worth the trouble, or showed up an hour later when it was already too late." Yates gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "I try not to let my mind wander down that path too much. The very thought of a life without you, without all this, it's just too heavy to bear. But I also believe that somehow, some way, we would have found our way to each other. Some things are just meant to be." Penelope smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I like that idea. That no matter the circumstance, we were destined to meet, to fall in love, and to build this whole life side by side. I was adrift before you found me," Yates said with a quiet strength. "Not just laid up with fever out on the range, but in every way that truly counts. I had no direction other than staying alive, no dreams past the next paycheck. You gave me a reason to live, Penelope. You gave me a home, a family, and a future to look forward to. Every single good thing in my life started with you, when you chose to stay by my side when that fever hit, to fight for me, when you had every right in the world to just ride on by. I'll be thankful for that choice for all of eternity." They sat quietly as the stars began to pop out, one after another, filling the great big prairie sky with their light. Off in the distance, a few head of cattle made some soft noise. Closer to the house, they could hear their grandkids laughing while they played one last game before bed. Maria's voice carried from the kitchen, calling everyone inside for evening prayers and a little something to eat. Those were the sounds of family, of a home, of a life that was lived well and loved deep. Yates and Penelope Zander lived to a ripe old age, staying busy on the ranch until their bodies finally told them it was time to slow down. They had the joy of watching their children grow up and their grandchildren become a whole new crowd. They witnessed the start of a new century, which brought changes to the West they sometimes understood and sometimes felt a little sad about. The wide-open ranges they knew in their youth started getting carved up by fences. The wild frontier they remembered was slowly tamed into settled farms and tidy towns. But through all those changes, their love for each other never wavered. It was their rock in a changing world. When Yates passed on in 1918 at 64 years old after a short spell of sickness, Penelope's heart was heavy but not broken. She had been blessed with 42 years with the man she adored, which was more than a lot of people ever get. They had built a good life, raised 3 children who became fine, capable adults, and created a legacy that would carry on for generations to come. She found peace in those truths, and in knowing that Yates had left this world feeling loved, with his family all around him in the home they made together. Penelope herself lived on for another 6 years, passing away in her sleep in 1924 at the age of 67. She was laid to rest right next to Yates in the little family cemetery, up on a hill that looked out over their ranch. Their children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren all gathered round to say their goodbyes and to celebrate them. They remembered 2 people who loved with all their might, who built something that would last from a chance encounter on the prairie and a simple choice to care for another soul in need. The big cottonwood tree where Penelope first found Yates stood tall for many more decades, becoming a kind of legend in the family. The young Zanders were always told the story of how their grandma rode out all by herself and found their grandpa near death from a fever. They heard how she stayed right there with him through the worst of it, refusing to leave his side until the sickness finally broke. They were told how that one single act of kindness started a love that changed both of their lives, creating the family and the ranch that they all now got to call home. That old tree became a symbol of hope and of not giving up. It was a reminder of how small acts of goodness can spread out in ways we can't even see, build in futures we could never have dreamed of. Generations down the line, Zander kin were still running that ranch, still telling the story of Yates and Penelope, and still visiting that old cottonwood tree whenever they needed to remember where they came from and who it was that fought to give them the good life they had. The details might have gotten a little bigger over the years, the way family stories tend to do, but the heart of it always stayed true. It was a story that showed how sometimes love finds you when you least expect it, born from hardship and a lucky break, and from the simple choice to stay when it would have been a whole lot easier to leave. And when you get right down to it, that was the real legacy Yates and Penelope left behind. It was not just the ranch or the family name or the earthly goods they gathered. It was the lesson that choosing to care, choosing to stay, and choosing to fight for another person's life and happiness could change the whole world. That real love was not built on big fancy gestures, but in the everyday decision to be there, to be kind, and to be a partner in the realest sense of the word. Their story became a reminder that we never know when the most important moment of our life is going to show up. It might just happen on a plain old day in a plain old place, looking like a simple choice to help somebody who needs it. Or Yates, it came when a fever knocked him flat out on the open range, making him helpless and all alone. For Penelope, it came when she decided to ride out and stay, to fight for the life of a complete stranger who would end up meaning everything to her. He was burning up with a fever alone on the prairie. She rode out and stayed until it passed, and from that simple start, from that one moment of trouble and compassion, a whole new world was made. It was a world full of love and family and heritage, of dreams that were built and troubles that were beaten. It was about 2 people who found in each other everything they had ever been looking for, and a whole lot more. In the end, it was a love story that would stand the test of time. Not because it was perfect or because they never had a struggle, but because it was true. Because it lasted through the good times and the bad, through sickness and in health, through all the years the good Lord gave them together. Because they picked each other. Not just that one time standing at an altar, but every single day that followed. Because when the fever showed up, no matter what shape it took, they stayed. They put up a fight. They saw it through together. And that, their children and grandchildren would say for years to come, was the real way you measure love. It was not about big speeches or fancy romantic things, even though those were nice. It was about the quiet, stubborn will to stay put when leaving would have been a whole lot easier. To care when not caring would have kept you safe, to fight for one another, for their family, and for the life they were building side by side. No matter what trials came their way, the prairie wind still whistled across the range where Penelope had stumbled upon Yates all those years ago. The grass still grew up tall and green in the summer, turned to gold in the fall, and slept under a blanket of winter snow. The big cottonwood tree stood watch over it all, with its roots dug deep in the earth and its branches reaching up toward that never-ending sky. And somewhere in that timeless place where love lasts longer than a lifetime, Yates and Penelope are still riding together across that open range, forever young, forever in love, and forever tied together by the choice she made on a blistering August morning in 1876 to stay right there until the fever broke. Their story was told and told again, becoming a piece of the family legend, but also something bigger than that. It became a reminder to every person who heard it that we all find ourselves at different times in our lives. We are either the person burning up with fever out on the open range, or we are the person who rides out to give them help. That we all have the power inside us to change lives, including our own, with simple acts of kindness and courage. That love, the kind that is real and built to last, is not made in the easy moments, but in the hard ones when we choose to stay instead of riding away. And so the story ends right where it started, out on the open range, under that great big prairie sky, with two people whose paths crossed at just the right second in just the right way. It started with a fever that broke and a love that never did. It started with a choice to stay that rippled down through the generations, creating waves of love and family and legacy that would last as long as the prairie grass grew and the wind blew free across the land they both held so dear. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community, 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 being part of our community.